In the Northern Hemisphere summer of 2014, fighters from the group that would become known as Islamic State drove bulldozers into a stretch of sand berm on the border between Iraq and Syria. They tore a hole through it and posted the video online. Their message was blunt: "This is the end of Sykes-Picot." For most people watching, the name meant nothing, but for people in the region, it meant everything. A 100-year-old agreement negotiated in secret between two empires, with nobody from the region they were dividing ever invited into the room. So what was Sykes-Picot? Why did an agreement most people have never heard of become propaganda good enough to declare a caliphate over? Today, we're going back to 1916, to a quiet room in London, and tracing exactly how two diplomats' afternoon still shapes the news that you watch tonight. Hey, I'm Michael, and welcome to Hoodie History. If you're the kind of person who wants to understand not just what happened in history, but why the world looks like the way it does today, hit subscribe, because that's what I explore here. And between episodes, the Hoodie History newsletter goes even deeper. It's free, and you'll find the sign-up link at hoodiehistory.com or in the description below. So by 1915, the Ottoman Empire had ruled most of the Middle East for 400 years, stretching from the Balkans to the Arabian Peninsula. Constantinople governed the region loosely through a patchwork of provinces: Ottoman Syria, the Ottoman provinces later grouped together as Iraq, and the Arabian territories around Mecca and Medina. There were no countries called Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, or Jordan in the modern sense. Those were provincial and geographic names, not sovereign states with fixed borders. Then, in October 1914, the Ottoman Empire entered the First World War on the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary. Almost overnight, its Arab provinces became a battleground contested by Britain and France, both of whom already held colonial territory nearby. Britain in Egypt and the Gulf, France in North Africa and among Lebanon's coastal communities, where it had long-standing religious and commercial ties. Britain saw an opportunity. If the Arab populations of the empire could be encouraged to revolt against Ottoman rule, it would weaken a wartime enemy from within. So in 1915, the British High Commissioner in Egypt, Sir Henry McMahon, began a correspondence with Sharif Hussein bin Ali, the Ottoman-appointed guardian of Mecca and Medina. Over 10 letters exchanged across the following year, McMahon offered British support for an independent Arab kingdom stretching across much of the Arab Middle East, in exchange for Hussein leading a revolt against the Ottomans. But the offer came with a catch, buried in careful diplomatic language. McMahon's most important letter, dated 24 October 1915, excluded certain coastal districts from the deal. Areas Britain knew France also had its eye on. Exactly which territories that exclusion covered was left deliberately vague. Vague enough that historians are still arguing over precisely what Hussein was, and wasn't, promised. Hussein read the letter as a guarantee of Arab independence and agreed. What he didn't know was that at almost exactly the same time, Britain was negotiating a very different arrangement with France. That arrangement began in November 1915 when a British Foreign Office official named Sir Mark Sykes sat down with his French counterpart, François Georges-Picot, to negotiate what Britain and France would each get out of the Ottoman Empire's collapse, regardless of what had been promised to anyone else. Sykes was a wealthy conservative MP who'd actually travelled extensively through the Ottoman Empire as a young man, and had even published books about his journeys there. He knew the region far better than most of his colleagues in Whitehall, but that knowledge hadn't created respect for it. If anything, it had convinced him he understood the Middle East well enough to redesign it, filtered entirely through an imperial lens that treated ancient societies as pieces to be arranged on a map. Sykes-Picot was a career diplomat from a family with deep colonial interests in France's Levantine ambitions, particularly around Lebanon and Syria. Over several months of quiet meetings, largely conducted away from public view, the two men, with Russian diplomat Sergei Sazonov also involved, since Russia was a wartime ally with its own claims on Ottoman territory, drew a line across the map of the Middle East. It ran roughly from the Mediterranean port of Acre in the west to Kirkuk in the northeast of what's now Iraq. North of that line, France would take direct control of coastal Syria and Lebanon, and hold influence over an inland zone stretching toward Mosul. South of it, Britain would take direct control of southern Iraq and hold influence over an inland zone covering much of Jordan and central Iraq. Palestine, given its religious significance to multiple faiths, was earmarked for a form of international administration rather than being assigned outright to either power. This detail can be surprising. This wasn't really about drawing modern national borders at all. Sykes and Picot weren't sitting there thinking, this bit will be Iraq, this bit will be Jordan. They were dividing the region into zones of direct control and zones of influence, a colonial carve-up, not a nation-building exercise. The specific borders of the countries we know today were worked out later by other people in other rooms, but the zones Sykes and Picot agreed to would become the skeleton those later borders were built on. The agreement was formalized in May 1916 through an exchange of letters between the British and French foreign secretaries. Not a single grand signing ceremony, but a bureaucratic correspondence kept secret from the public, from Hussein, and largely even from other parts of the British government dealing with the Arab Revolt. Both empires understood exactly what they were doing, making a private arrangement to inherit Ottoman territory that neither of them had yet won on the battlefield, while a separate arm of the British government was simultaneously promising much of that same territory to an Arab ally. Then, in June 1916, Hussein launched the Arab Revolt against Ottoman rule, believing he was fighting for the independent Arab kingdom that McMahon had promised him. British forces, including a young intelligence officer named T.E. Lawrence, later known to the world as Lawrence of Arabia, fought alongside Arab forces, and Lawrence himself would later write of feeling deep unease at encouraging Arab fighters toward a goal he knew Britain had already privately compromised. But the contradiction stayed hidden for over a year. Then, in November 1917, it collapsed into public view, twice within days of each other. First came the Balfour Declaration, a public statement from the British government expressing support for the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, while also stating that nothing should prejudice the civil and religious rights of the existing non-Jewish communities there. It added a third overlapping wartime promise about the same territory, one that remains, to this day, one of the most contested single sentences in modern diplomatic history, and one I won't aim to adjudicate in this episode today, only to note as part of the layered promises made about the same land. Then, weeks later, the Bolsheviks seized power in Russia, and in the process gained access to the former Tsarist government's diplomatic archives. Looking to embarrass the old imperial powers, they published the secret Sykes-Picot Agreement in a Russian newspaper, and it was quickly picked up by international press. For the first time, Hussein and the wider Arab world could read, in black and white, that Britain had privately agreed to divide their promised kingdom with France, while publicly encouraging them to fight and die for it. It's hard to overstate how that moment landed. Imagine discovering mid-revolt that the ally you trusted had already agreed to a very different outcome to the one you were fighting for, months before you'd even started fighting. British officials scrambled to reassure Hussein the agreement wouldn't necessarily apply as written. Hussein pressed on with the revolt anyway. By that point, there wasn't really another option, but the trust that had underpinned the alliance was gone, and it never fully came back. Ottoman and German propaganda seized on the leak immediately, broadcasting it to Arab audiences as proof that Britain's promises were worthless, a message that would echo in different forms for the following century. The Arab Revolt continued through to the war's end in 1918, and Arab forces alongside British troops helped take Damascus in October that year. But the men who'd fought under Hussein's banner entered the city believing independence was finally within reach, unaware of just how little they'd actually been given in deciding their own future. For the next 2 years, the promises collided in slow motion. In 1920, the victorious Allied powers met at the San Remo Conference in Italy and formally carved the former Ottoman Arab provinces into League of Nations mandates, a legal structure that allowed Britain and France to administer the territories while, in theory, preparing them for eventual independence. France received the mandate for Syria and Lebanon. Britain received the mandates for Iraq and Palestine. The lines drawn at San Remo weren't identical to the Sykes-Picot line, but they grew directly out of the zones Sykes and Picot had negotiated 4 years earlier. Hussein's son, Faisal, who had led Arab forces into Damascus, was briefly declared King of Syria by a Syrian National Congress in March 1920. But France didn't recognize the claim. Within months, French forces defeated Faisal's small army at the Battle of Maysalun and installed direct French control instead. Britain, keen to manage its own promises to the Hashemite family without provoking further unrest, then offered Faisal a consolation. In 1921, at the Cairo Conference, Britain made him King of Iraq instead, a kingdom stitched together from 3 former Ottoman provinces, Mosul, Baghdad, and Basra, which had spent centuries under the same empire but had never been administered as a single political unit, and whose populations hadn't been consulted about becoming one now. Faisal's brother Abdullah was made emir of a newly created Transjordan, carved out of the British Mandate east of the Jordan River, largely to give him something too. This is where the story starts overlapping with headlines that you've probably seen more recently. The Kurds, meanwhile, had been promised the possibility of their own state under the 1920 Treaty of Sèvres, a promise that was never ratified and was replaced in 1923 by the Treaty of Lausanne, which contained no such provision. The result was a Kurdish population left divided across the new borders of Turkey, Iraq, Syria, and Iran, a division that still shapes Kurdish politics and the region's conflicts today. Palestine remained under British Mandate administration, carrying the unresolved tension between Balfour's promise and the Arab populations already living there, a tension that, in the following decades, hardened into one of the world's most enduring and closely watched disputes, one this episode won't attempt to resolve, only to trace its administrative roots. By the time these mandates ended, Iraq in 1932, Lebanon and Syria in the 1940s, Palestine in 1948, Jordan in 1946, the borders in place were, in their broad shape, still recognizably the ones sketched out in that London negotiation decades earlier. What strikes me about this story is how knowingly the contradiction was built in. This wasn't simply poor coordination. British officials in the Foreign Office, the India Office, and the Arab Bureau were aware, at various points, that the promises being made to the French and the promises being made to Hussein sat uneasily together. But they chose to proceed anyway, because winning the war mattered more than reconciling the paperwork. That's not quite the same as a single grand conspiracy. Different parts of the British government were probably not talking to each other as closely as they should have been, but there was real awareness that these commitments were in tension, and a willingness to let that tension sit unresolved while the fighting continued. I keep coming back to how ordinary that decision might have felt at the time, Nobody seemed to think how they were setting up terms for the next 100 years of conflict. They were solving an urgent, immediate problem with the tools they had available to them and letting the harder questions wait for another day. Sykes reportedly said later in his life that he wished he could take a red pencil and draw the line differently, but he didn't get the chance. I also think it's worth reflecting on the fact that this isn't ancient history. The people whose grandparents lived through the Arab Revolt are, in many cases, still within living family memory. The borders are still contested in places. The Kurdish question is still unresolved. This story hasn't fully finished yet, and that's part of why it still shows up in the news today. So back to that bulldozer tearing through the berm between Iraq and Syria in 2014. Whatever else that moment was, it was also a piece of historical theatre, a group deliberately invoking a 100-year-old secret agreement most of their audience might have never heard of, to argue that the entire map of the region was illegitimate from the moment it was drawn. That argument only lands because the underlying history is real. Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Jordan, their borders genuinely were shaped by a wartime deal between two empires who'd never invited the people living there into the room, laid on top of promises to Arab and Jewish communities that were never fully reconciled with each other or with the colonial map beneath them. And that's the direct line from a quiet room in London in 1916 to a bulldozer on a sand berm in 2014, and to plenty of what you're still seeing in the news headlines today. So I'll leave you with this. When you see a border dispute or conflict in the Middle East reported today, how much of it do you think traces back to decisions made in 1916, and how much comes from choices made by the people who've lived there since? And do you think there was ever a version of this story where the outcome could have been different? So that's the story of why the map of the Middle East looks the way it does, and why two diplomats' quiet negotiation in 1916 still echoes through news bulletins more than a century later. Thanks for being here. If this story reframed something you thought you understood, let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear which part surprised you most. And that thumbs up for the episode really does help this channel reach more people. If you're new here, hit subscribe. I publish new episodes regularly, tracing the origin of something you live with right now back to the moment it was made. You can find me on Instagram and TikTok at Hoodie History. I publish short history videos there regularly. You can also catch my shorter stories on my YouTube Shorts channel at Hoodie History Shorts. And if you want to go even deeper, I've written history ebooks that are available now. You'll find the links in the description. If this story changed how you see the world, there are more where it came from. I explore more details and stories in the Hoodie History newsletter. You can sign up for free at hoodiehistory.com or hit the link in the description. And if you're not already subscribed, hit that button now so you don't miss what's coming next. I hope you can join me next time.